200 armed men stood shoulder to shoulder around the stone terrace above the Callsign Valley, rifles slung low and eyes hard, and Captain Wes Marlow had roughly 4 minutes left before the meeting he had spent 3 weeks building collapsed into open gunfire in front of every camera and every witness who mattered. Beside him, waved to the back of the circle the way she always was, stood Sergeant Noa Farid, callsign lyric, the interpreter nobody on that terrace had ever once looked at directly, and she was the only person standing on those flagstones who understood every word Militia Commander Farzad Beg had just said, in a voice gone low, flat, and final. The shura had started well enough, or well enough by the standards of a valley that had spent 2 years bleeding itself dry over a water rights dispute nobody outside it would ever have heard of. Elder Rahmat, gray-bearded and dignified in a way that made the whole terrace feel like it belonged to him rather than to the militia ringing it, had opened the meeting with the customary long silence, the kind that Marlow had been coached to sit through without fidgeting, and for the better part of an hour the talk had moved the way talk was supposed to move in that country. Slow, circular, freighted with more meaning in a pause than in a sentence. Then Farzad Beg had stood up. He was younger than Rahmat by 2 full generations, built like a man who had spent his adult life carrying a rifle rather than a walking stick, and the moment he rose to his feet, every one of the 200 fighters positioned along the low stone walls surrounding the terrace shifted their weight in a single, rippling motion that told anyone who knew how to read a crowd of armed men exactly what was coming. The dispute itself had never been complicated to explain, only impossible to resolve, which was precisely the kind of problem this valley specialized in producing. A canal built 2 generations earlier had diverted the Callsign's only reliable water source away from the terraced fields below Sarabek village and toward a newer settlement further downstream, a settlement whose elders had, over the years, quietly allied themselves with outside interests, eager for a foothold in a region that mattered far more strategically than its poverty ever suggested. Farzad Beg had grown up on the losing side of that canal, watching his own family's fields crack and yellow, while a settlement he considered thieves grew fat on water his grandfather had once controlled, and he had spent the better part of a decade turning that specific grievance into the militia now ringing the terrace, 200 men who trusted him precisely because he had never once pretended the anger wasn't personal. Marlow's 3 weeks of shuttle diplomacy had been built around a single, carefully engineered outcome, a revised water-sharing agreement that gave Beg's faction enough of a win to stand down without losing face, brokered through Elder Rahmat's standing as the valley's most respected voice. And it had been, right up until the moment Beg rose to his feet, cautiously, fragilely working. Shura protocol carried its own quiet grammar, one Marlow had studied for years, and Noa had lived inside since her earliest training, and every detail of that grammar had been observed with unusual care that morning, which was precisely what had made the meeting's collapse so unsettling to anyone paying attention to more than the words. Elder Rahmat had been offered the first bowl of tea as always, passing it once around the circle before drinking himself, a small ritual signaling that today's business was still being conducted in good faith. Farzad Beg had been seated 2 places down from the elder rather than directly beside him, a placement that marked him as a rising voice, worth hearing, but not yet an equal, a distinction Noa suspected he felt more sharply than anyone in that circle had accounted for. She had watched, over 6 weeks of these meetings, how precisely the valley's men arranged themselves around questions of rank and grievance, without ever once naming the arrangement aloud, the way a man's boots pointed toward or away from the center of the circle, the half-second delay before a junior fighter spoke after an elder had finished, the specific silence that followed an insult too large to answer directly. None of it showed up in any after-action report Marlow had ever filed. All of it had told her, within the first 10 minutes, that Farzad Beg had not come to negotiate, he had come to be seen refusing to. Marlow knew how to read a crowd of armed men. He had built his entire career on reading rooms just like this one, on running negotiations in villages just like this one, and he had walked into this shura with a script he trusted. 3 weeks of shuttle diplomacy compressed into 40 minutes of choreographed talking points, a script that had accounted for almost everything except the possibility that Farzad Beg would simply decide, in real time, that talking was finished. Beg's voice had risen. His hand had come up in a short, chopping gesture toward the perimeter, and the fighters along the walls had begun, unhurried, and without any apparent order given aloud, to bring their weapons up off their shoulders and into their hands. It did not look, from where Marlow stood, like an ambush. It looked worse than that. It looked like 200 men arriving, all at once and without a single shout, at the same quiet decision that this meeting was over, and that the next thing to happen in this valley was going to be settled the old way. SSG Quinn Dobbs, running security at the edge of the terrace with a patrol of 9 soldiers, against a crowd that now outnumbered them more than 20 to 1, keyed his radio without taking his eyes off the nearest cluster of fighters and reported the obvious in the flattest voice he could manage, because panic in a transmission spread faster than panic on a face. All stations, weapons coming up on the perimeter. Repeat, weapons coming up. We are 200 meters from anything that could reasonably be called support. Nobody answered him for 3 full seconds, because there was nothing useful to say back. The nearest quick reaction force sat at Combat Outpost Halyard, 40 minutes out on a road that had been rated unsafe for exactly this kind of rapid movement since the rains had started, and 40 minutes against a clock that had just visibly started running the moment Farzad Beg raised his hand, was not a number that helped anyone standing on that terrace. Dobbs ran his own private accounting of the 9 rifles under his command, the 200 now facing them, and the flat, unglamorous math that told him a fighting withdrawal from an open terrace surrounded on 3 sides by higher ground was not a plan so much as a description of how the day would end badly. And he set that accounting aside for the moment, because there was still, barely, time for something other than a firefight to happen first. Marlow turned, instinctively, toward the one resource he had left that hadn't already failed him. His interpreter, standing exactly where he had positioned her that morning, 2 steps behind his left shoulder and slightly to the rear, present in the room the way a radio or a notebook was present in the room, useful, necessary, and never, under any circumstance he had ever imagined, expected to matter more than the words she was there to carry for someone else. What he saw when he turned was not the interpreter he had waved to the back of every meeting for the past 6 weeks. He saw Noa Farid step forward, past his shoulder, past the invisible line she had stood behind in every shura she had ever worked for him, walking directly toward Elder Rahmat and the wall of raised rifles behind him with a calm that made absolutely no sense given the 4 minutes, or fewer, that everyone else on that terrace understood they had left. To understand why Wes Marlow had never once, in 6 weeks of working alongside her, thought to ask Noa Farid a question that went deeper than the next sentence he needed translated, you had to understand the particular kind of invisibility that came with the job she did. Interpreters attached to line units occupied a strange, in-between space in every room they entered, present at the most sensitive conversations any patrol would ever have, trusted enough to be handed the raw, unfiltered words of village elders and militia commanders alike, and yet almost never treated as a source of judgment in their own right, only as a conduit that carried someone else's judgment across a language barrier. She had learned, early in her deployment, that the fastest way to be effective in that role was to disappear inside it completely, to let officers and NCOs alike forget, minute to minute, that a mind was operating behind the words she was relaying, evaluating tone and posture, and the 20 small signals a language carried that a direct translation could never fully capture. Her very first week attached to Marlow's patrol had set the pattern that would hold for the 6 weeks after it. At a smaller meeting with a district administrator, before she had earned so much as a nickname among the soldiers she rode with, a visiting logistics officer had leaned toward Marlow and asked, in a voice pitched just loud enough for her to hear, whether the interpreter needed a chair or preferred to stand, as though the question of her comfort were the only relevant thing about her presence in the room. Marlow had answered on her behalf without missing a beat. "She's fine standing. She's just here to translate." And Noa had said nothing, because saying something would have meant explaining a version of herself that didn't fit inside the 11 seconds available to correct a stranger's assumption, and because 6 more weeks of exactly this kind of moment had already taught her that silence, in that particular context, cost her considerably less than correction did. One detail from that training had surfaced in her mind more than once since the patrol first rotated into the Callsign Valley, though she had never mentioned it to Marlow or to anyone else on the patrol. Sarabek's name had appeared, unexplained and unglossed, in a single sentence of a briefing document she had read years earlier during her own training, a sentence that mentioned the village only in passing, attached to no operation and no further detail, the kind of throwaway reference that meant either nothing at all or something someone had gone to considerable trouble to keep from meaning anything to a casual reader. She had thought about that sentence twice since arriving in the valley. Once on the drive in, watching the terraced fields come into view exactly as a training photograph had shown them years before, and once during her first conversation with Elder Ramat, when something in the old man's formal, careful manner of speaking had struck her as familiar in a way she couldn't yet place. She had filed both moments away without acting on them, the way she filed most things that didn't yet demand a decision, and she would not understand until the terrace itself demanded one exactly how much that single unglossed sentence had been trying to tell her. There had been a smaller version of this same moment 3 weeks earlier, at a preliminary meeting with a district administrator, that nobody on the patrol had thought twice about at the time. The administrator had used a phrase in passing, an old idiom about a debt owed to the mountains themselves, that Noa had rendered in her translation as a simple pleasantry, judging correctly that the room wasn't ready to hear its actual weight, and that flattening it into small talk served the mission better than surfacing it. Marlow had noticed nothing beyond a smooth, competent translation, and moved the meeting along, never once registering that his interpreter had just made an editorial judgment call worth an entire afternoon of cultural advisor briefings, quietly, invisibly, and correctly, the way she made a dozen calls like it in every meeting she worked, and never once got credit for making. It was the kind of skill that only ever became visible in its absence, and for 6 weeks, its absence had never once been tested. Marlow had introduced her to every shura the same way for 6 weeks running, a habit so automatic he had likely never once noticed himself doing it. A small gesture toward the back of the seating arrangement, a murmured, "She's just here to translate," to whichever local official needed reassuring that the woman in the room wasn't there to negotiate, decide, or influence anything, only to move words from one language into another and then step back out of the conversation entirely. It was, in its way, a kind of professional courtesy extended to the officials he was there to work with, a signal that the American captain understood and respected the room's existing hierarchy well enough not to let a junior enlisted interpreter, and a woman in a country where that fact carried its own weight, be mistaken for someone with actual standing at the table. Noa had never corrected him. Correcting him would have meant explaining herself, and explaining herself would have meant surfacing things about her file, her training, and the 18 months she had spent before this deployment that she had decided, on her own and without being told to, were nobody's business unless the moment absolutely demanded it. What her file said, for anyone with the clearance and the patience to read past her language scores, was that Sergeant Noa Farid had come up through an unusual pipeline for someone who now sat quietly at the back of shuras taking notes. She had been recruited midway through her enlistment, into a small, low-visibility program built to pair soldiers with unusual language aptitude alongside human terrain and civil affairs specialists working in the mountain districts. A program that trained its people not just in vocabulary, but in the deep grammar of hospitality, obligation, and honor that governed how those districts actually functioned underneath the formal politics everyone else negotiated with. Most of what she had learned in that program had nothing to do with words at all. It had to do with debts. Every village in those mountains kept its own long unwritten ledger of who owed what to whom, going back generations sometimes. And the program had taught her that the fastest way to lose a village's trust forever was to misread that ledger even once, and the fastest way to earn it, if you ever earned it at all, was to understand it better than the people who lived inside it. The training itself had been unglamorous in a way that surprised her at the time. Long weeks spent not on weapons ranges, but in windowless classrooms studying the specific dialect layers that separated formal address from intimate address. The precise phrases a guest used to accept hospitality without giving unintended offense. The difference between a debt spoken of casually and a debt invoked formally. An invocation so rare and so weighted that most soldiers who trained beside her would go their entire careers without ever hearing one spoken aloud in the field. Her instructors had drilled a single rule into her more than any other. Language like that was not a tool you reached for to win an argument or smooth over an awkward silence. It was closer to a match struck once in a room full of dry kindling, and every person who taught her that program had known someone, or known of someone, who had struck it wrong and burned down 20 years of careful trust in a single sentence. Her instructor in that program had been a soldier almost nobody in her current unit had ever heard of. A quiet, unassuming man who had spent the better part of a decade building relationships in exactly these mountains under a call sign that had, by the time she trained under him, already become something close to legend among the very small circle of people who'd worked adjacent to his old network. A call sign she had never once spoken aloud to anyone in her current unit. Not because she'd been ordered not to, but because doing so would have required explaining a debt of her own that she was not yet certain she would ever need to collect on. She carried what he'd taught her the way she carried her notebook, close, quiet, and almost never opened in front of anyone who hadn't earned the right to see inside it. 6 weeks of shuras with Wes Marlow had given her exactly 0 reasons to open it. Standing on that terrace, watching 200 rifles come up around a shattering negotiation, she understood, with total clarity, that the reason had just arrived. Marlow's plan for that morning, the one he had briefed to Dobbs, and to the 2 civil affairs specialists riding with the patrol, had never once accounted for a scenario in which the negotiation simply broke down mid-sentence into a standoff, because every version of the shura he had rehearsed in his head over 3 weeks of preparation had assumed that talking, however slow and however frustrating, would keep working right up until it produced either an agreement or a polite, unresolved postponement. Protocol on interpreters was clear and, under ordinary circumstances, entirely sensible. They translated exactly what was said, in exactly the register it was said in, without editorializing, without inserting their own judgment, and absolutely without initiating conversation on their own authority, because an interpreter who started improvising in a room full of armed men and fragile alliances was an interpreter who could unravel months of careful diplomatic work in a single sentence. Noa had followed that protocol without exception for 6 weeks. She understood exactly why it existed, and she had never once resented it, because most days it was the correct rule for the room she was standing in. The stakes, sitting underneath that protocol, went well past the 9 soldiers and 1 captain standing on that particular terrace, a fact Noa understood better than almost anyone else present, because it had been drilled into her from the very first week of her training. A shura that ended in gunfire in the Callsign Valley would not stay contained to the Callsign Valley. Word of a failed negotiation between an American patrol and a 200-strong militia would travel to every neighboring valley within days, hardening every other elder's willingness to sit across a table from a foreign uniform ever again, and undoing not just 3 weeks of Marlow's diplomacy, but years of slower, quieter trust-building that other patrols in other valleys were depending on to keep their own negotiations alive. She had watched, during her training, exactly one recorded case study of a shura that collapsed the way this one was collapsing, and the case study had ended not with a single incident contained to a single afternoon, but with an entire district effectively closed to negotiation for the following 2 years. That was the real ledger she was running in her head as the rifles came up. Not just 9 lives against 200, but a valley's willingness to ever sit down and talk again. Marlow, for his part, was running his own version of a losing calculation, and doubt was only the smallest part of it. He had built his reputation in this command on exactly this kind of shura: patient, careful, procedurally correct, and some stubborn part of him, even as the rifles came up, wanted to believe that a sentence of his own might still turn the room if he could only find the right one fast enough. An instinct that had served him well in a dozen easier rooms and was, in this one, actively costing him the half-second he needed to notice that his interpreter had already solved the problem he was still trying to name. He would think back on that half-second many times in the weeks afterward, turning it over the way a man turns over a mistake he can't quite call a mistake, because the truth he eventually had to sit with was simpler and harder than any tactical error. He had spent 6 weeks certain he understood every capability in his patrol, and the single most decisive one had been standing 2 steps behind his shoulder the entire time, filed under a job title that had never once prompted him to ask what else it might contain. This was not most days. Standing 2 steps behind Marlow's shoulder as Farzad Beg's hand came up and 200 rifles rose off 200 shoulders in a single unhurried wave, Noa ran the same kind of brutal, unsentimental arithmetic that her old instructor had once told her was the only honest way to make a decision when a clock like this one started running. Quinn Dobbs and his 9 soldiers could not hold that terrace against 200 fighters for longer than it took the first shot to be fired, regardless of how disciplined and well-trained every one of them was. The math simply did not exist that made 9 rifles a meaningful deterrent against 200, and everyone on that terrace with actual combat experience understood that fact without needing to say it aloud. The quick reaction force at Combat Outpost Halyard was, at absolute best, 35 minutes away on a road route clearance had flagged as marginal after the recent rains, which meant the honest estimate ran closer to 50, and 50 minutes against a standoff that had roughly 4 left in it before somebody's finger tightened on a trigger was not a rescue plan. It was a number that described exactly how many people would already be dead by the time help arrived. Along the perimeter, the patrol's youngest soldier, a private first class named Toby Wren, who had been in country only 11 weeks, felt his mouth go completely dry as he watched the fighters nearest him settle their rifles into low, ready positions with the unhurried familiarity of men who had done this before and expected to walk away from it regardless of how it ended. He kept his own weapon low, exactly as Dobbs had briefed, before they'd ever left the outpost that morning. Nothing raised, nothing sudden, nothing that could be read as the first move in a fight 9 of them could not win. And he found himself doing his own version of Dobbs's math, without meaning to, counting the distance to the nearest low wall, counting the seconds it would take 200 men to close that distance if the terrace went loud, and arriving, like everyone else on that patrol, at a number that offered no comfort at all. Dobbs moved along his own line twice in those first tense seconds, murmuring the same low instruction to each soldier in turn. Hold, eyes on Farid. Nobody moves until I move. Because some part of him, without yet knowing why, had already decided that whatever came next depended on the interpreter standing at the center of that terrace, rather than on any of the rifles ringing it. Beneath the tactical math sat a second, quieter calculation that only Noa Farid, standing on that terrace, had the information to run at all. She understood in a way nobody else present could that Farzad Beg's rage was not simple bloodlust dressed up in political language. It was the specific, wounded fury of a man who believed, rightly or wrongly, that Elder Rahmat's older generation had traded away the valley's water rights to outside interests without properly honoring the customs that were supposed to govern exactly that kind of decision. She had caught, in the last exchange before Beg rose to his feet, a phrase buried inside his accusation that Marlow's translator earpiece would never have rendered with its full weight intact, even if she had been relaying it in real time. A phrase that touched on obligation and honor in a register that belonged to the oldest layer of the valley's own dialect, the layer her instructor had drilled into her years earlier, precisely because it was the layer that mattered most when everything else had already failed. The decision she made in the next several seconds was not, in her own accounting of it, an act of defiance against Marlow or against protocol. It was the same kind of arithmetic Dobbs had already run over his radio, and Marlow had already begun running behind his eyes as he searched, uselessly, for a sentence that might slow Farzad Beg down, the arithmetic of a person who understood that the ordinary rules of the room had just stopped applying, and that the only tool left on that terrace capable of buying the time nobody's rifles could buy was a language nobody standing there except her had any idea she actually spoke. She thought, for exactly one heartbeat, about the last thing her old instructor had told her before she left his training, a sentence she had carried for 2 years without ever once needing it. Some doors only open once, and you do not knock on them twice. Then she stepped forward, past Marlow's shoulder, past 6 weeks of standing exactly where she'd been told to stand, and walked toward Elder Rahmat with her hand rising, palm open, in the universal gesture for wait. Marlow's hand shot out instinctively to catch her arm and missed by half a step, his voice cracking out behind her in a harsh whisper that carried more alarm than command. "Farid, stand down. That is not your lane." And she heard him clearly enough to register every word of it, and kept walking anyway. Because there was no version of the next 30 seconds in which stopping to explain herself did anything but cost the valley the only window it had left. Dobbs, watching from the perimeter with his rifle held low and steady, felt something shift in his own understanding of the woman he'd shared exactly 9 convoy rides and 1 bad night at Halyard's chow hall with, a shift that had less to do with what she was doing than with the sheer unhurried certainty in the way she was doing it. Nothing in her posture read as panic or improvisation or a soldier making a desperate last-second gamble. It read, to a man who had spent enough years around genuinely dangerous people to recognize the difference, like someone walking a path she had walked before. The 10 meters between Marlow's shoulder and Elder Rahmat's seat took her, by her own later estimate, perhaps 6 seconds to cross, though every soldier on that terrace who watched it happen would swear afterward that it felt considerably longer, stretched by the particular way time behaves in the seconds before something either resolves or breaks entirely. She kept her hands visible the whole distance, palms open at waist height, her pace even and unhurried in the specific way her instructor had once told her mattered more than almost anything else in a moment like this one. A rushed approach read, to men holding rifles, as a threat regardless of intent, while a slow, visible approach read as exactly what it was, a person choosing to be seen rather than choosing to hide. Farzad Beg's eyes tracked her the entire distance, his raised hand still frozen in its half-finished gesture, and for the first time since he'd stood up to end the negotiation, something in his expression shifted from certainty to a kind of wary curiosity, the look of a man watching a variable enter his calculations that he had not accounted for at all. The terrace had gone strange around her in the way that only real danger produces, a heightened, over-bright clarity that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with a nervous system running as fast as it could to keep up with a body that had decided to keep walking anyway. She could hear with unnatural precision the small sounds a standoff like this one produced, and that a calmer morning would have buried entirely. A rifle sling creaking somewhere to her left, the dry scrape of a boot shifting on stone, Marlow's breathing gone ragged and shallow behind her, the distant bleat of a goat somewhere below the terrace wall, indifferent to everything happening above it. The sun sat directly overhead, throwing short, hard-edged shadows across the flagstones, and the light caught, here and there along the wall of fighters, on rifle barrels and belt buckles, and the silver thread of an old man's turban. 100 small glints that would have meant nothing on an ordinary morning, and meant everything on this one. She did not let herself think about any of it directly. She let it exist at the edges of her attention, the way her training had taught her to let a threat exist, without letting it choose her next move for her. And she kept walking. She stopped 4 paces from Elder Rahmat, close enough to speak without shouting, and far enough to keep her hands visible to every fighter on that wall, and for one long second the entire terrace seemed to hold its breath around her. Farzad Beg's raised hand, frozen mid-gesture. The ring of rifles paused in that awkward half-second between rising and leveling, Marlow behind her with his mouth still open on the second half of a sentence he never finished. Then Noa Farid spoke, and what came out of her was not the trade language she had used for 6 weeks of shuras, not the formal, careful register Marlow's earpiece had been trained to recognize, but the old mountain tongue of Sarabek village itself, the deep dialect layer that belonged to almost nobody outside these specific slopes, spoken with an accent and a cadence that made Elder Rahmat's head come up sharply, as though he had just heard something he had not expected to hear again in his lifetime. 12 words, that was all it took. And every soldier on that terrace who spoke enough of the trade language to catch fragments of it would later swear the room changed before she'd even finished the sentence. The salt debt of the winter siege still stands. I have come. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture toward the rifles, or toward Farzad Beg, or toward anyone at all, because the words themselves were not addressed to the crowd. They were addressed, specifically and only, to Elder Rahmat, in the register a person used when invoking an obligation that predated every argument currently splitting his village in half. An obligation older than Farzad Beg's rage and older, in its own way, than the water dispute that had brought 200 rifles onto that terrace in the first place. Elder Rahmat did not answer her in words at first. He simply stared at her for what felt, to everyone watching, like an impossibly long time, his weathered face moving through something that looked almost like recognition, trying to locate itself in a face that was far too young to have earned it honestly. And then, slowly, deliberately, in complete silence, he rose from his seated position at the center of the shura circle and turned to face the wall of armed men behind him, men who had been 30 seconds earlier his own village's militia, and were now, in the sudden hush that had swallowed the terrace whole, simply an audience waiting to learn what their elder had just heard. Farzad Beg's raised hand finally dropped, not in surrender, but in confusion. The specific confusion of a man watching an authority he had spent the last hour openly challenging, suddenly reassert itself through a channel he had never once thought to guard against. A debt spoken in a tongue almost nobody in that valley still used fluently, invoked by a foreign soldier's interpreter who, by every account he'd been given about her that morning, was just there to translate. Nobody on that terrace moved for what felt, to every soldier watching, like an unreasonable length of time, though the truth, when Dobbs checked his watch afterward out of pure professional habit, was closer to 11 seconds. 11 seconds was long enough for a ripple of low, uncertain murmuring to pass through the nearest cluster of Beg's fighters, men glancing sideways at each other for some cue about how to react to an interpreter speaking words that had visibly startled their own elder. It was long enough for Marlow to feel, with a kind of sick, falling clarity, that he had no idea what had just happened in a negotiation he had spent 3 weeks believing he understood completely, and long enough for Quinn Dobbs, watching from the perimeter, to lower his own rifle a half-inch without consciously deciding to, some instinct in him recognizing, before his conscious mind caught up, that the terrace's center of gravity had just shifted somewhere he could not see. Noa herself stood perfectly still through all 11 seconds, hands still open at her sides, giving Elder Rahmat exactly the space her training had taught her a debt like that one required. No pressure, no repetition, no second attempt to fill a silence that belonged, for as long as it needed to last, entirely to him. What Elder Rahmat said next, in the same old dialect Noa had used, carried across the terrace in a voice pitched to reach every fighter along that wall, and Noa translated it for Marlow under her breath in a low, steady murmur that he would replay in his memory many times over the following weeks. Not because the words themselves were complicated, but because of what they revealed about a history he had never once suspected existed underneath 6 weeks of shuras he had believed he understood completely. "There is a debt this valley carries," Rahmat told his own fighters, "older than the water, older than the argument you have all come here armed to settle. And it was paid to my father's village by a stranger who never once asked for anything in return. In the winter, the siege should have taken every one of us, and did not. This woman speaks with that stranger's tongue and that stranger's manners, and I will not stand by while 200 rifles answer a debt like that with blood." Fazad Beg pushed back once, his voice rising again as he demanded to know what siege, what debt, what stranger Rahmat was speaking of, and Noa watched the elder's face settle into something that looked almost like grief as he answered him, not with a full explanation, because full explanations belonged to people who had earned the right to hear them. And Farzad Beg, for all his standing in the village, had been a boy small enough to be carried on his own father's shoulders the winter it happened, but with enough of the shape of the story to make his fighters understand that this was not a matter any of them had standing to override. Years before any soldier currently standing on that terrace had ever set foot in this valley, Sarabek had been surrounded during a hard winter by an outside force intent on making an example of it, and the siege that should have ended the village entirely had ended instead without a single shot fired, resolved quietly by a nameless operative who had spent years building exactly the kind of trust that made such an ending possible, and who had asked, in return for that intervention, only that the village remember it, and that it never speak the stranger's name to anyone who had not earned the right to hear it spoken. What Rahmat did not say aloud on that terrace, though Noa caught the shape of it in the particular way his voice dropped on certain words, was the specific cost that winter had almost extracted. Sarabek's storehouses had been down to the last of their grain by the time the siege reached its 3rd week, its men outnumbered on the high ground above the village by a force that had made clear, through a runner sent down twice, that surrender terms would not be offered a 3rd time. The stranger who ended it had not come with soldiers or supplies. He had come alone, on foot, up a trail the besieging force hadn't bothered to watch because no single unarmed man made sense as a threat worth guarding against. And whatever he said in the tent above the village that night had never been repeated in full to anyone outside the small circle of elders who had been present for it. Only the outcome had survived intact in the village's memory. The siege lifted within 2 days, without a shot fired by either side, and a debt entered into the valley's unwritten ledger that Rahmat's father had insisted, for the rest of his life, be honored exactly as it had been promised, whenever and however it was ever called upon. Noa had never met that operative. She had trained under the person who had, a quiet instructor who carried the call sign Juniper the way some men carried a rank, spoken of only in the smallest circles of a program built to teach soldiers exactly the kind of cultural fluency that made moments like a winter siege end in silence instead of gunfire, and who had, years into her training, sat her down on the last evening of her course and taught her the exact 12 words she had just spoken on that terrace. She still remembered the room where it happened, a bare classroom lit by a single overhead lamp, her instructor turning the phrase over slowly, correcting her pronunciation twice on the third word until she had it exactly right, and telling her afterward, in a voice that carried none of the drama the moment deserved, that this particular phrase had once ended a siege that should have cost an entire village its future, a phrase Juniper had used personally, decades earlier, to end that very siege, and had passed on to her afterward as something closer to a key than a lesson, with a warning that stayed with her every day since. You may never need this. If you ever do, you will only get to use it once, and it will only work if the debt behind it is real. She had carried those 12 words for 2 years, through 18 shuras and 6 weeks of standing quietly behind Wes Marlow's shoulder, never once certain whether the day would come that required them, and she had known, the instant Farzad Beg's hand came up, that the day had arrived. What happened across the following several minutes was not dramatic in the way gunfire would have been dramatic, and that quiet was, in its own way, exactly the point. Elder Rahmat walked slowly and without any escort, along the entire length of the stone wall where his fighters stood, speaking to small clusters of them, in a voice too low for Noa to translate fully, and one by one, in a ripple that moved the opposite direction from the one that had raised their rifles minutes earlier, the fighters of Sarabek lowered their weapons, shouldered them, and began, without any order given aloud that Dobbs or Marlow could hear, to disperse from the terrace in 2s and 3s. Toby Wren, still holding his own rifle low along the perimeter, watched a fighter no older than himself lower his weapon and glance once, almost sheepishly, toward the woman who had just quietly ended the standoff, and something in that brief, unguarded look told him more about what had just happened than any radio report ever could have. Farzad Beg held his ground the longest, staring at Noa Farid across the width of the shura circle with an expression that mixed anger and something closer to wonder. And then he too, finally, lowered his rifle, turned, and walked away without another word, leaving the terrace nearly empty except for the elder, the interpreter, and a patrol of 9 soldiers who had just watched 200 armed men turn around without a single shot fired by anyone. Chief Warrant Officer Des Kanu, the intelligence liaison stationed at Combat Outpost Halyard, listened to Marlow's after-action debrief that evening with the particular stillness of a person hearing something they recognized but could not immediately place, and asked him twice to repeat the exact phrase Farid had used on that terrace. When Marlow gave it to him a second time, translated as closely as Noa herself could render it into English, Kanu set down the coffee he'd been holding and asked for her by name, because a phrase invoking a salt debt tied to a winter siege had crossed his desk exactly once before, buried in a decade-old file cross-referenced under a call sign he had not expected to see surface again in his career. Juniper, a name attached to a single unclassified line describing a siege, ended without a shot fired, and a network of village trust built so quietly and so carefully that almost nobody outside a very narrow circle had ever known the details or the cost of how it had been built. Kanu found Noa Farid in the interpreter's tent an hour later, and their conversation, brief and careful on both sides, filled in pieces of a history she had carried alone for 2 years without ever having anyone else to set it against. Master Sergeant Cal Mercer, Juniper, had died 3 years before Noah's own first deployment. The specifics of his death still sealed in a file Kanu had only partial clearance to summarize. But the trust he had built in these mountains, had outlived him in the one place. Trust like that was ever meant to outlive anyone. In the memory of a village that had never forgotten what he'd done for them, and in a phrase he had handed to a young soldier years later, trusting her to know, when the moment came, whether it was real enough to spend. He'd want to know it worked, Kanu told her, quietly. And Noa, who had spent 2 years wondering whether she would ever get to say that to anyone who understood what it meant, simply nodded, because there was nothing else that needed saying. Wes Marlow found her outside the tent afterward, and he did not try to dress up what he said next in more words than it needed. He told her plainly that he had spent 6 weeks waving her to the back of every room they'd worked together and calling her presence in it an afterthought, and that he had been wrong in a way that went considerably deeper than simple bad manners. He had been wrong about what her silence actually contained, mistaking 6 weeks of professional restraint for 6 weeks of having nothing more to offer than translation. He told her that starting with the next shura, she would sit at the table, not behind his shoulder, and that any word she chose to add beyond direct translation would carry his full backing without him needing to hear the reasoning behind it first. It was not, he understood even as he said it, an apology large enough to undo 6 weeks of a habit he'd never once questioned. It was at least a start, and Noa accepted it the way she accepted most things that actually mattered, quietly, without needing it dressed up any further than that. Quinn Dobbs said less about it than anyone, which was in keeping with the kind of NCO he had always been, but he made one change to his own habits that outlasted the deployment by considerably longer than anyone expected. He began, without ever announcing it, positioning Noa Farid at the center of his security formation in every shura that followed rather than at its edge, briefing his soldiers before each meeting that the interpreter's read of a room carried the same weight as a spotter's read of a battlefield, and was to be treated, from that morning forward, exactly that seriously. He never told Noa directly what that terrace had cost him to watch. The particular helplessness of holding 9 rifles that could do nothing useful against 200, while the only person capable of actually changing the outcome walked toward it unarmed. But she understood it anyway, the way soldiers usually understood the things their sergeants didn't say, and the two of them settled into an unspoken partnership over the following weeks that neither one felt any need to put into words. The following week's shura proved Marlow honest about it. He opened the seating arrangement himself this time, placing Noa at the table beside him rather than behind him. And when a minor dispute over grazing rights threatened to sour the morning's talks, he turned to her before he turned to anyone else and asked, in front of the assembled elders, what she thought the room actually needed to hear next. A small gesture, unremarkable to anyone who hadn't watched 6 weeks of the opposite happen, and enormous to the two people who understood exactly what it had cost him to change. Elder Rahmat, seated near the front of that second shura, found a quiet moment afterward to speak with Noa alone, away from Marlow and the rest of the patrol, and told her, in the old dialect she had used to turn his village's rifles around, that he had known Juniper only briefly in the last winter of that siege, and that he had spent every year since wondering whether the debt would ever need to be called on again, or whether it would simply sit quietly in the valley's memory until the last person who remembered it was gone. "You are not the stranger who paid it," he told her, "but you are the one who kept the door open, and in this valley, that is its own kind of honor." She did not have an answer worthy of that sentence, so she offered him the only one she had, a small bow of the head, the same gesture her instructor had taught her years earlier for exactly this kind of moment. And Rahmat, watching her do it correctly without having to be shown, seemed satisfied that the debt had found its way, after all these years, into hands that understood what it actually meant. Elder Rahmat sent word through a village runner 3 days after the standoff that he wished to meet again, and the message that arrived at Combat Outpost Halyard did not ask for Captain Marlow, or for the patrol, or for any American negotiator by rank or title. It asked, specifically, for lyric, the call sign Noa had carried through 2 years of quiet, careful work, and had never once expected a village elder to learn, let alone use in a formal request relayed through official channels. She rode into that second shura in the lead vehicle of the convoy rather than the third, seated where the patrol's senior interpreter was supposed to sit and had somehow, in 6 weeks, never once occupied, and when Quinn Dobbs caught her eye in the mirror as the trucks rolled out through the gate. He didn't say much, only that it was good to have her up front where she belonged, and neither of them felt any need to add the word that used to precede her role in every sentence anyone on that patrol had ever said about her. Nobody called her just anything anymore. She was simply Sergeant Farid, callsign Lyric, the soldier who had turned 200 rifles around with 12 words, and a debt 3 years older than anyone standing on that terrace had known to look for. And the valley remembered her the same careful, permanent way. It remembered everyone who had ever earned the right to be remembered inside it. Farzad Beg did not return to another shura for 2 weeks, and when he finally did, he arrived without his usual escort crowding the terrace walls, sitting instead in the circle proper for the first time since the patrol had arrived in the valley. He said little to Noa directly, and what he did say, delivered stiffly in the trade language rather than the old dialect, amounted to an acknowledgement rather than an apology, that he had not known the debt his own elder carried, and that a man who fought for his village's water had no business fighting against something older than the water itself. It was not warmth, and Noa did not mistake it for warmth. It was, in its own guarded way, exactly the kind of respect this valley extended to people who had proven themselves inside its own rules. And she understood, watching him take his new seat in the circle, that it was worth more than an apology would have been. If this story held you the way it was meant to, hit like, subscribe if you're new here, and drop a comment telling us whether you'd have stepped past the captain's shoulder the way she did, or waited for permission that might never have come in time. We read every single comment, and we've got more stories coming about the quiet, overlooked people who turn out to be exactly who a room needed all along.